Absalom was the type of man who, upon entering a room, made everyone stop what they were doing just to look at him. He had a presence that hypnotized. He was beautiful, confident, charismatic. The people of Israel saw him as the perfect reflection of a king. His long, heavy hair, cut once a year and weighing almost 2 kilos, became a legend. But Absalom's story doesn't begin on the throne. It begins in the heart of King David, his father. Son of Maacah, princess of Geshur, Absalom was born surrounded by influence and prestige. From a young age, he carried the expectations of a great future. David loved him deeply, perhaps more than his other sons. Among his brothers, Absalom stood out not only for his appearance, but for his intelligence and ability to win people over with sweet words and calculated gestures. He knew how to listen, he knew how to hug, he knew how to promise, and people loved him for it. In his youth, it seemed that destiny was smiling on him. He lived in Jerusalem, surrounded by luxury, with access to the best advisors, teachers, and soldiers. He lacked nothing, but behind all this beauty and brilliance, there was a hidden fire, a silent restlessness, a hunger that went far beyond the approval of his father or the affection of the people. It was a thirst for power, but in that beginning, no one saw it. All that was seen was a charming young man with all the traits of a promising leader. Before we continue, I want to tell you one thing. If you have come this far, it is because God has something powerful to reveal to you today. Comment on this video, "God, I love you." Like this video and subscribe to our channel. Do not ignore this. God wants to speak directly to your heart. Absalom seemed molded to reign. Even the wise men of Israel commented on his noble posture, his way of speaking, his sense of justice. He was the prince of dreams, a distorted reflection of David himself, with all the beauty, but without the same submission to God. However, as happens with leafy trees, what is seen on the outside can be deceiving. While the people applauded him and his father admired him, the roots of his soul began to entangle themselves in the darkness of pride. The first act of his tragedy was still far from happening, but the stage was already set, and when fate blew the winds of injustice over his family, something inside him broke, and the mask of the perfect son began to crack. The crack appeared when horror knocked on the door of the royal family, a deep wound caused not by enemies from outside, but by blood of the same blood. Tamar, Absalom's sister, was destroyed from the inside by someone who also carried the name of David's son. Amnon, half-brother of the two, took by force what could never be returned. It was a vile, repulsive act, and the silence that followed was even more cruel. Absalom watched his sister's pain grow like a shadow inside the royal house. Tamar, once joyful and respected, now walked covered in ashes with a heart in ruins. He took her to his house, tried to console her, tried to protect her from the world, but there was no comfort that could heal what was taken from her. And what perhaps hurt even more was David's response. The king, father of both, was angry, but did nothing. There, before his father's omission, Absalom began to change. Disappointment turned into ice. He stopped seeing David as a hero and began to see him as a man too weak to protect his own. In Absalom's heart, justice became a personal cause. He didn't scream, he didn't cry in public, he didn't go hunting immediately, he just waited. For 2 long years, he cultivated silence as a weapon. Absalom was silent, but time did not erase what Amnon had done. On the contrary, it matured the seed of revenge like a bitter fruit. He didn't just want justice, he wanted balance. If the king's sword did not move, he would raise his own hand. Tamar's honor cried out for an answer, and deep down, the prince knew that this wasn't just about his sister. It was about his name, his position, his control over the narrative of that broken family. When the right moment came, he orchestrated a trap, a party, a celebration between brothers. He invited everyone, including Amnon. On the outside, a banquet. On the inside, a settling of accounts. And in the middle of the music and wine, the order was given. Amnon fell, killed by the sword of servants loyal to Absalom. There were no shouts of victory, just a sudden escape. Justice was done, but the price was exile. And as he rode away from Jerusalem, Absalom carried not only the weight of Amnon's death, but something more dangerous, the bitter taste of a power he had experienced and would never forget. Absalom fled, but he did not flee as a coward. He fled as someone who had completed a personal mission. Amnon was dead. Tamar's honor, although unrecoverable, had been avenged. But the sword he used to do justice also cut the link that bound him to the throne of Israel. For 3 years, he lived far from the court, exiled in Geshur, his mother's homeland. 3 years in which his absence was felt and commented on by all the people. In the eyes of many, he was the hero who did what the king did not have the courage to do. After all, Amnon was the firstborn, the direct heir. Killing a brother like that was not just a response to Tamar's pain. It was a declaration of strength, of autonomy. But what began as an act of justice began to take shape inside as a seed of revenge. Absalom was not just satisfied to have corrected an injustice. He had tasted the power of making decisions that changed the course of the nation. In exile, time did not bring regret. It brought conviction. Away from his father's presence, Absalom matured a different vision of himself, from prince to judge, from judge to executioner, and from executioner to future king. Because in his heart, he began to see himself as someone who could not only replace David, but as someone who should. While David wept for his dead son, the other living son became a mythical figure among the people. And even being far away, Absalom was still the subject in the squares, in the city gates, in the meetings between the elders. People remembered the beauty, the intelligence, the audacity. Some condemned him, but many admired him. When Joab, David's general, realized that the king would never take the first step, he himself orchestrated the return of the exiled. He knew that David's heart still beat for Absalom, even wounded. He also knew that the prince's absence created a dangerous political vacuum, and so, with a curious strategy, he brought back to Jerusalem the one that everyone thought had disappeared. Absalom returned, but not as a repentant son. He stepped back into the capital with the gaze of someone who knows that justice, when manipulated by pride, does not end with death. It only changes shape. The dust had barely settled when the eyes of Jerusalem turned to him. Absalom returned mounted, imposing as if he had never left, but something in him had changed. He was not the same young man who had cried for Tamar. Now, the silence carried intentions and the smile hid calculations. Although he was back, the reconciliation with his father was not immediate. David allowed his return to the city, but forbade his presence in the palace. For 2 years, they lived in the same city, without exchanging a single word. On the outside, Absalom seemed to wait, but on the inside, a frustration was fermenting that grew with time. He was not just a son in search of forgiveness. He was a man with a thirst for recognition. And David's silent rejection only reinforced the idea that the throne was weakened, without courage, without direction. If his father didn't want him around, the people did, and that was enough. Reconciliation only happened at the insistence of Joab, the same general who had enabled his return. But when Absalom realized that Joab hesitated to help him again, he sent for him. Joab did not come. He called again. Nothing. So Absalom burned his barley fields. It was his way of saying, if you don't want to listen to me, you will feel my presence. The strategy worked. Joab went to him, and soon after, the meeting with David finally happened. The moment between father and son, contrary to expectations, was not marked by emotion. There are no records of long dialogues, tears, or hugs. Just a dry gesture. Absalom prostrated himself, and David kissed him. He was rehabilitated, officially, but the emptiness between the two remained. A political kiss, not a paternal one, a gesture that sealed Absalom's return to royal society, but not to his father's heart. With the reconciliation formalized, Absalom now had freedom. Freedom to walk among the people, to present himself in public, to occupy strategic spaces, and that's exactly what he started doing. The banished son was now the reintegrated prince, but what no one saw clearly was that he had not returned just to reconcile. He had returned to position himself. The silence of exile taught Absalom to observe. Now he would use everything he learned to conquer, with cunning and smooth words, what he believed was his by right, the heart of Israel. No throne is conquered in one leap. Absalom knew that. True power is not just in the crown, but in the trust of the people. That's why he didn't go straight to the palace, he went to the city gates. That's where the cases were judged, where the humble sought justice and the leaders listened to the cry of the tribes. David, already older and overburdened, did not appear frequently. Absalom, on the other hand, was always there, before sunrise, positioned as someone who came to listen, welcome, resolve. With noble clothes and sweet words, he approached people with a smile. When someone bowed before him, he extended his hand and lifted him up, saying that everyone was equal in his eyes. And more, he said that their causes were just, that they deserved attention, and insinuated that if he were a judge in Israel, everyone would have justice. It was seductive, the type of leader that made people feel seen, valued. In a short time, he began to be called Prince of the People, not by title but by perception. His name ran through the mouths of the anonymous as a living hope. And while this was happening in the silence of the palace, David seemed not to realize that his son was building a parallel reign, not in the palace, but in the hearts of the multitudes. Everything was calculated. Absalom did not rush. Each gesture was a seed planted. Each hug was a promise. Each smile a vote won. He built a public image of justice and proximity, but behind this facade there was a plan. To destabilize confidence in his father's government, weaken his authority, and present himself as a legitimate alternative to the throne. For 4 years, the conspiracy grew like a leafy tree, rooted in flattery and nourished by ambition. And then, when he judged that the time had ripened his harvest, he asked his father to go to Hebron under the pretext of fulfilling a vow. But what he took there was not a sacrifice to the Lord. It was the beginning of a silent coup. While trusted men were sent to all the tribes with secret orders, the people heard a new proclamation. Absalom reigns in Hebron. The prince who judged at the gates now marched to be king. When the trumpets echoed from Hebron with the cry of Absalom reigns, the farce came to an end. The disguise of the loyal son fell apart, revealing the face of the traitor. The conspiracy, once whispered between gates and streets, now roared before the nation. The son who once kissed his father with apparent reverence now plotted against him a cold, structured coup, supported by influential leaders and by the heart of a people who, for 4 years, was carefully seduced. The rebellion was not a spark. It was a bonfire fueled with patience and promises. And by declaring himself king in Hebron, Absalom not only challenged David's authority, he tore the structure of the royal house. And more than that, he tore his father's heart. When David learned of the uprising, the impact was immediate. There were no fiery speeches or attempts at direct confrontation. He understood that Absalom's rebellion was not just a political threat. It was something personal, deep, irreversible. In silence, he made an unthinkable decision: to flee. Jerusalem saw the king leave in haste, barefoot, crying, with his face covered. The most faithful servants followed him, but many remained, hesitant, insecure, not knowing who to support. That image was symbolic. David descending the Mount of Olives, humiliated, while his own son ascended with escort and acclamation towards the throne that did not yet belong to him. Absalom entered the city with confidence. He took the palace, took the advisors, surrounded himself with power. It seemed that everything was within his reach. But power without legitimacy is a blade without a handle. It cuts whoever tries to wield it. What Absalom did not see was that, by taking the throne, he also took upon himself the weight that came with it. It was not enough to look like a king. It was necessary to bear the burden of being one. Meanwhile, David, even outside the city, gathered forces. The army that followed him was small, but loyal. And in the heart of the old warrior, something reignited. He had already defeated giants, persecutors, betrayals, and now, once again, he would have to fight. Not for honor, not for glory, but for survival. The war between father and son was about to begin, and the battlefield would not only be the desert, but the divided heart of Israel. The sun had not yet dried the morning dew when David crossed the gates of Jerusalem barefoot. It was not just the king who left. It was a broken father, wounded by the invisible sword of betrayal. The city, accustomed to seeing him march in victories, now saw him leave in silence, like an exile in his own land. Absalom's rebellion had wounded more than the politics of Israel. It had crushed the soul of the man who once faced Goliath with a sling and faith. Each step of the escape was heavy. The Mount of Olives, which so often had been a place of prayer, was now the path of humiliation. David wept as he ascended, covered his face with his cloak, and those who accompanied him did the same. It was a cortege of pain, a slow-motion lament. But in the midst of that desolation, the old king still demonstrated wisdom. He refused revenge, rejected haste, trusted in God. He entrusted the destiny of the throne into the hands of the one who chose him from the beginning. Even away from the throne, David continued to be king in spirit. On the way, he found men who wanted to fight for him, priests who brought the Ark of the Covenant, but he ordered them to take it back to the city. It was as if he were saying, "If the Lord wills, he will bring me back. If not, let his will be done." David fled from the sword, but he did not flee from faith. Meanwhile, Absalom established himself in the palace with arrogance. He took advice, surrounded himself with powerful men, and acted as if the throne was already his by eternal right. But he did not realize that David, even in flight, still possessed what no usurper could buy: true loyalty. His valiant men followed him for love, not for advantage. And that would make all the difference. In the desert, the king reunited with old allies, men like Ittai the Gittite, who swore allegiance even though they were foreigners. And it was there, far from the city, that David began to trace the response, not of hatred, not of revenge, but of resistance. He knew he could not ignore the war, but he also knew that deep down he was still a father, and the enemy, this time, had his face and his blood. The war between father and son did not begin with crossed swords. It began in silent rooms, between whispers and strategies. Absalom, sitting on the newly occupied throne, summoned the most influential advisors to decide his next step. Among them, two names carried opposite destinies: Ahithophel, the ruthless strategist, and Hushai, David's faithful friend, infiltrated in the shadows of the palace. Ahithophel was feared for his wisdom and precision. What he said happened. His plan was clear, direct, and cruel: to attack David that very night while he was still vulnerable and shaken. The order would be quick, surgical. Eliminate the king before he could gather forces. Kill the father before the throne was contested. Absalom listened, but hesitated. It was then that Hushai stood up. With engaging words, feigning loyalty to the new king, he proposed something different. He said that David was astute, dangerous, experienced in war, that a hasty attack could become a disaster. He proposed instead to gather the entire army of Israel, march with great force, and crush David with public glory, so that everyone would see Absalom's supremacy. It was a longer plan, but shrouded in prestige. What Absalom did not know is that Hushai was there by David's instruction, sent to sabotage Ahithophel's advice and buy time. And it worked. Hushai's charm and Absalom's vanity met at the exact moment. He rejected the most effective advice and chose the most theatrical. This decision changed the course of the war. When Ahithophel realized that his advice was ignored, he did not protest. He just returned to his house, put his affairs in order, and took his own life. It was as if he knew that by rejecting his guidance, Absalom had signed his own sentence of defeat. Meanwhile, Hushai sent secret messengers to David, warning him of the plan and giving him time to flee even further and organize his troops. The war, once almost won by speed, now gained new layers of suspense and tension. The king was no longer defenseless. The army began to line up. The outcome was approaching. And the next time father and son crossed paths, it would not be between hugs, but between spears. The morning of the battle arrived. The chosen field was not an open field, but a dense forest, full of treacherous roots, hidden stones, and natural traps. It was the type of terrain where strategy outweighed brute force, exactly the environment in which David, an old warrior, knew how to fight like no one else. Absalom, on the other hand, relied too much on the grandeur of his army and on his own image. David, even at the head of the smaller of the two armies, divided his forces well and chose experienced generals, Joab, Abishai, and Ittai. But before the battle began, he gave a clear order: "Deal gently with the young Absalom, for my sake." That phrase was more than a command. It was a cry of contained pain. Even betrayed, David still saw the son. The combat was brutal. In the forest of Ephraim, Absalom's soldiers were surprised. The trees seemed to move in favor of the king. The terrain swallowed his fastest warriors. Thousands fell not by the sword, but by confusion and the dangers of the environment itself. It was a silent massacre. And in the midst of that chaos, Absalom rode with haste. Mounted on his royal mule, he crossed the trees as if he could escape the approaching judgment. But his symbol of vanity became his death bond. His long hair became entangled in the branches of an oak. The mule continued, but he was left hanging between heaven and earth, without support, without crown, without glory. The prince who charmed crowds now swayed like an exposed body among the branches of destiny, alone, defenseless, without allies nearby. When Joab heard, he did not hesitate. He ignored David's order. He took 3 darts and thrust them into Absalom's heart. Then other soldiers finished the job. The body was thrown into a pit in the middle of the forest, covered with stones, as if it were just one more among so many. There were no honors. There was no public mourning. The man who dreamed of the throne ended up buried by his own pride. The war was won, but the price paid was not only in blood, it was in soul. Because when the news reached David, the throne returned to be his, but his heart would never be whole again. The news arrived like a blow without warning. The messenger ran, brought confirmation of the victory. David's army had triumphed. Israel was safe. The throne was intact. But the king's face did not light up. He did not look for strategies, nor celebrate the return of the kingdom. He looked for only one answer: "Is the young Absalom well?" And when he heard the words, "May the king's enemies be like that young man," David understood. The son was dead. There was no more battle to win. There was nothing more to rebuild. The heart of the warrior who once did not fear armies broke before a single loss. David went up to the room above the city gate and collapsed there. The pain broke through the walls of royalty. The lament of a father took the place of the king. He cried loudly, inconsolably, repeating as if words could resurrect the past. "My son Absalom, my son Absalom, if only I had died in your place." David's pain was not just for the death of a son. It was for the life that could have been, for the conversations that did not happen, for the delayed hugs, for the distance built step by step between two hearts that once beat in the same compass. Absalom, with all his mistakes, was still his boy, the one who grew up under his roof, who ran through Jerusalem, who was once hope. Joab, seeing the king's commotion, did not remain silent. He said harshly that this public lament could make the army ashamed of the victory. that the soldiers risking their lives were being ignored. David then got up, recomposed himself, but the tears did not cease inside. The throne was restored, the enemies dispersed, peace, little by little, returned. But something in David remained broken. Absalom's death was not just the end of a rebellion, it was the echo of everything that sin had sown within that family. In the end, the king won the war, but he lost the son. And in the lines of David's pain, the hardest lesson of his story is engraved. The greatest victory of a king will never be greater than the mourning of a father. If you like biblical stories like this one of Absalom, I invite you to subscribe to our channel so you don't miss the next videos. Leave your like and share this video with someone you love and needs to learn more about the Word of God. May God bless you, and until the next video.